On the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome back to this program. Are you the Washington bureau chief of the Intercept?
That's right.
The Washington
the bureau.
The Washington bureau chief of the Intercept, and the author of many books. His most recent is From Jesse Jackson to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez: The End of Big Money and the Rise of a Movement. We've Got People. It just occurs to me that the book that you wrote on drugs has almost like that project's almost over.
Well, this is a nice sequel to that in some ways, but you're right, and that book was magic in a way that it managed to completely transform the conversation without anybody actually having bought it.
Sometimes the cover can just do that.
Boom. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Best cover in the last 100 years in book literary history.
This, I was just telling you off air that I'm really enjoying this. I mean, it is because a lot of this, not all of it, but a significant amount of it was contemporaneous from when I basically entered into politics and began to, sort of have some access to some of the players in this book, and certainly people who were talking and stuff that I just had no idea was going on, and it's it's super interesting, and we'll go through it. Let's just start with We've Got People. It's a specific quote, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, it's ripped off from the kind of climactic line in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's viral campaign ad. She said something like, in her campaign against Joe Crowley, this is a contest about money versus people. They've got money, we've got people. And like so much of what she does, she's great at like distilling things down. And I heard that phrase, and I was like, we've got people, they've got money, we've got people. Like that basically, puts not too fine a point on the coverage that I've been doing of the Democratic Party and the resistance within it for the last like 12 years or so. And so, yeah, I lifted 3 words of it for the title.
When you look at these 12 years that you did the coverage, and you start the book during Jesse Jackson's campaign, his first one, I guess, was in 84, but 88, he comes pretty close. And then I want to go back, but just to keep it just a little general, like, is this a story of, because it seems to me there's two sort of parallel tracks that are more or less aligned, but not completely aligned, of ideology within the party, or with like sort of a disposition within the party. Do you know what I'm saying by that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think by disposition, you kind of mean the fighting spirit.
Yes.
The willingness to take risks, to say what you really believe, to put it out before the American people and trust in their kind of judgment, versus the parallel generation of people like Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Chuck Schumer, who lived through the Reagan years and internalized the idea that we live in this irredeemable conservative center-right country, and that the only way for Democrats to cling to some modicum of power is to pretend that they're somewhat conservative as well. And so it creates a different disposition. And it's been interesting going out on this book tour and talking to people who've actually read the book, which is very flattering. And so many of them just say, why won't these Democrats fight? It's not even that they are pining for them to win even necessarily. They just want them to fight for something. And if you put up a fight and you lose, at least you went for it. There's some dignity in that. But that I think disposition is a good way of putting it.
And well, I want I want to circle back, but let's have part of this conversation now. I mean, because, during the Netroots years, right, when you basically started reporting and more or less when I entered into, doing whatever it is I do here, you didn't, and part of it was because it was during the Bush years, right? And it sort of flattened out any differences amongst Democrats from an ideological perspective, right? Like I mean, I just remember like this dawning on me, like, oh my God, when I was talking with Jonathan Alter in a green room at MSNBC, and he's saying like, I don't understand why people are being so chaste about Social Security. And I was like, what? You wrote an autobiography? You wrote a biography about FDR? Are you kidding me? Like, I had no idea that you were that open to cutting, but we didn't talk much about ideological differences. 15 years ago, 12 years ago, it was, you'd say good Democrat, bad Democrat. You would say fighting Democrat, non-fighting Democrat. Like, how much of that disposition is it? And then I want to go back to the Reagan years. But how much of that disposition or how much of that disposition is just simply disposition? I'm cowed, and I just, and now I have a tin ear. I learned some lessons, as a newbie, and those lessons have stuck. Versus ideologically, I'm actually sort of this way, and I use the disposition as a way of not having to deal with that.
Yeah, I think it's entirely related to ideology, and the way that you can kind of prove that in a way is to take a look at somebody like Rahm Emanuel. He's known as a fighting Democrat. I think you might have been in that off the record private blogger meeting in, I think, 2005 with Bill Clinton, where he said, I don't understand why you bloggers are so tough on Rahm. He's really a fighter. But who he was a fighter against was the left.
Right.
So they do know how to fight. Democratic Party to this day knows how to fight. Look at the ECCC and the lengths that it's willing to go to crush insurgent primary challenges before they've even been launched. And so when the opportunity to go after the left surfaces, then all of a sudden their disposition changes, and they do become these fighting liberals. And so that leads me to conclude that the disposition is really just a piece of ideology, that they do know how to fight, but they're just accustomed to not fighting for the left, but rather against the left.
Right. But I don't know if that still fully answers my question as much as like they're afraid to fight the right because your argument is during the Reagan years. And it's interesting to peg it at the Reagan years, because I think a lot of times, like 10 or 15 years ago, we would have pegged it to McGovern, maybe even more recently, right? Like this was the lesson that people are living out from McGovern era. And that's why we called it hippie punching instead of like, punching to the left. It was hippie punching at that time. 10, 15 years ago, we refer to that, beating up on the left. And ostensibly like the way that they did it. But why is it the Reagan era? I mean, I remember going into college and having my government professor, the government professors address us on day one saying there's been a realignment. It was 1984. It was the second election. There's been a realignment in this country, and there's been a monumental shift in the political identification of the American public. Was that basically what scarred a lot of these people?
Yes, and I think it's totally fair to link McGovern to that. Like that was a precipitating event, and certainly you still hear them today, like talk about McGovern. Like literally to this day, they will mention, if we do X, it's just going to be McGovern all over again. But Mondale lost, extraordinarily badly as well. And the reason I focus more on the Reagan era is because not just, it wasn't just that McGovern lost, but you still had a kind of Rockefellerian kind of Republican Party at that time. So they everything they stood for wasn't being, thoroughly rejected. Whereas in the 1980s, this was the rise of the new right, this like insurgent Republican class comes in the 1978 midterms. That's when Newt Gingrich is first elected, then followed by Ronald Reagan, who's a new kind of Republican. And at the same time, Democrats are rethinking what their posture is toward their own coalition and toward particularly big money and corporate money. And so it's in that era that they kind of reinvent themselves as this what becomes this Clintonian party. So that's why I thought it was more interesting to focus on the 80s, and also because yes, like Pelosi and where these others, they did live through McGovern, but they were more in it when Reagan was stomping them. They were. Hoyer was, I think, elected in 1981 in a special election. Pelosi was already a major fundraiser. Chuck Schumer, I think, was elected to the House in 1980. Dick Durbin in 1982. Barney Frank in 80. So these people are all kind of coming into their own and their professional prime at that time where they're watching everything change underneath them.
And I think it was like Tony Coelho.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Coelho. He becomes DCCC chair after the 1980 election on the very explicit argument that the problem Democrats had wasn't political or ideological. Well, it wasn't ideological. It wasn't structural. It was just that they got outgunned by Republicans who figured out how to raise more money, and they figured out how to pump that money into negative campaigning and 30-second ads and dirty tricks. And so what Democrats needed to do, he argued, was develop what he called a PAC strategy, which just means fundraising today, and go to corporate America, get a ton of money, hire consultants like Republicans did, and run the same types of dirty tricks campaigns with 30-second negative ads, and just match them dollar for dollar, and just kind of keep putting your fingers in the dike that way.
And that was almost like the seed that ended up creating the Democratic Leadership Council and this whole wing.
Totally.
So now, how conscious do you think?
Remember, they won in 82, the huge midterm wave after Reagan. So they're like, oh, this is it. We got it.
We figured it out.
We figured this out.
Let me ask you this. How much was that? How much awareness was there and how much debate was there around that time as to the implications of getting Democratic money that way, right? Like, because it could be an awareness of like, I want to get us in bed with corporate America, or it could be like, oh, I'm just going to go, and hang out with corporate America, but I won't get in bed with them. I'm just going to take their money.
Right.
But inevitably what happens is one thing leads to another. You take their money and then you have a couple of drinks and then one thing leads to another, and then you're in bed with them and then you're in bed with them.
Yeah, and the argument they made was along those lines. Coelho said, look, yes, we lost the House. I mean, we lost the Senate, we lost the White House, but we still control the House. And they thought they had basically permanent control of it because of the structure and the popularity of a lot of these longtime Democrats. And so their argument was, we're not compromising ourselves here. We're not giving anything to corporate America, but we control the House of Representatives. And so they need to pay up. Like, that's how this new system works. Like, if they want their legislation considered, if they want to meet with us, if they want to be part of the tax reform that we're going to do, and all the other work that we're going to do with the Republican Senate and the Reagan administration, then they need to ante up. And that's how they sold it as not being corrupting. It's just exploiting the power that you already have to force a weaker entity to pony up. But there was, what I gathered in my reporting, there was a lot of pushback internally. But the people who were doing the pushback didn't have an alternative idea,
right,
or they didn't have the power to implement an alternative idea.
What does Coelho say today about that?
He has this great quote where he says, we didn't necessarily sell out. It was more that we were bought in. Was his phrase. And it's actually, as he kind of parses it, it's an interesting way of thinking about it.
That's a Mort Saul line.
Right. He's saying that like we wouldn't take a pile of cash and do something for it, but all of our strategic legislative thinking was constrained and guided by the PAC strategy that we were taking. That you're doing a housing bill, and this particular company or industry doesn't really like it going in this direction, and then you don't even need to talk to them. You just kind of don't go in that direction. You pursue the path of least corporate resistance wherever you can, and so that ends up just corrupting the process, but without a direct quid pro quo, cash for a particular line of legislation.
Did he express regret? I mean, I only ask, only focusing on something this is sort of small, because I think that dynamic that you've just described is really the hinge that all of this turns on.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean,
no, and he's a lobbyist now. So no, like he and a lot of the others feel, and it's not an obvious question, but so he and the others feel like there was nothing else that they could do.
Right.
They feel like they were facing the fascists, like they were at the gates. They're inside the gates, and the New Deal coalition had broken apart, and that without a new coalition to put together, this was their only choice, and that they did this, and they made some difficult compromises to save the republic from complete collapse. So there is not much regret. Now, people who say that people will acknowledge that people that talk to you from that era, they'll acknowledge, yes, it was a lot more corrupting, or it was as corrupting as people predicted that it would be, and more corrupting than its defenders said it would be. But many of them will still say, but there wasn't necessarily another option.
Now, the only other option would be to get thrashed and then come back from the ashes, reconfigured in a different way, right? I mean, because that would have been
right, and then they got thrashed anyway.
Right. All right. Well, then all right. So go forward to Jesse Jackson, because I mean, one can only imagine, like, if the internet had existed in 1986, right? Like,
right.
Our history might be very, very different in a myriad of ways. Right. But go ahead.
Right.
I mean, just tell us what happens with Jesse Jackson there.
And to that point, Jerry Brown, remember, in 1992 ran kind of an insurgent campaign against Clinton, and he used to give his 800 number.
Yeah.
He wouldn't take more than $100 from anybody. And
there was a problem during the debate, like if I remember correctly, too, right? Like they tried to get him, like, you can't say your 800 number. He goes, I can't say my 800 number, Jerry Brown, whatever it was. I can't remember what it was. But and they were like, well, you can't do that. I just did it. So.
I like the way that, Bernie said, go to BernieSanders.com. It was, very reminiscent of that. But Jesse didn't have that. And to your point, so Jesse Jackson, and I would have called the book, from Harold Washington to AOC, if more people had heard of Harold Washington.
Yes, actually.
He was
tell that story.
He was the
from mayor of Chicago.
Yeah, he runs as an insurgent. He's a member of Congress. He had the backing of Democratic Socialists of America, the young lords, like a ton of radical and insurgent elements of Chicago politics. They run to take on the machine, with Jesse Jackson as his lead campaigner. And I interviewed Jackson about this, and he said that he got wind that Ted Kennedy and Walter Mondale were going to come in and endorse Daley, and Jackson begged them. He said, "Just stay out. Like, you have no idea the vibrancy of this movement that we're running. Like, we don't need your endorsement, but just don't come in and bring the two most well-known Democrats in the country and endorse our opponent." And Kennedy said, "Look, we're old family friends. We don't have a choice, and we've got to do it." And Jackson said he thought to himself, "This needs to change." Like his quote was something like this: "This liberalism is not liberating. And so he started seeing himself and seeing that movement in direct conflict with the party establishment, even the kind of liberal heavyweights of the party. They wind up winning the primary, and then the entire Chicago Democratic machine flips and literally campaigns for the Republican in the general election. And Washington manages to win the general election, but only by like 4 points in a city that's 92% Democratic. And then they spend the next several years going to war with the machine that still controlled the council for a little while. But so out of that campaign, Jackson and other black leaders around the country get together and say, we need to do the same thing at the presidential level, because there's just no other way that we're going to get people to pay attention, to our interests. And so he runs in a very late campaign in 1984 that does surprisingly well, even though he got in, I think after some of the caucuses had already started. And so then he runs in 88 as a serious contender, echoes of Bernie, starting as a protest candidate and then getting serious. And more than 35 primaries and caucuses into the race, he dishes this stunning upset out to Dukakis and Dick Gephardt in Michigan. And all of a sudden, Dick Gephardt drops out, and it's just Jackson and Dukakis in basically a delegate tie. And the Democratic establishment in Washington has a complete and utter meltdown at the prospect that Jesse Jackson might actually become the Democratic nominee at this point.
And then what happens?
The whole fury of the party comes down on him, and they get very explicit that the country's not ready to elect a black man. A, B, he's too liberal, and C, it's not only would he lose the presidential election, but it would basically be the end of the Democratic Party. If he's the nominee, the phrases coming out of Washington were just absolutely apocalyptic. And he was polling ahead. Coming out of Michigan, he's now surging into Wisconsin and polling significantly ahead. And if he wins Wisconsin, then he's on a roll with momentum heading into the convention. And despite the big polling lead, he winds up losing pretty badly in Wisconsin. One of the first examples of pollsters, telling people that they're going to vote for the black candidate and then not doing so when they get into the polling place. And so from there, he fades. But for about a week and a half, the country was facing the real possibility that Jackson would win the nomination, and he was doing it on the back of this argument that kind of neoliberalism was inflicting economic violence on the working classes, white, black, and brown, and that the only way to fight back was to unite, farmers who are suffering from a farm crisis and factory workers and everybody else against the growing power of capital and Ronald Reagan.
So, all right. So I just want to sort of disaggregate a couple of things, because there's a sort of almost an analogous two-track type of fight that's going on here that's sort of similar to the one that we talked about, at the top of this interview, which is, in the case of Washington, and on some level in the case of Jesse Jackson, but it gets a little bit muddled because, the idea that, I think there were probably people who, and I'm not being an apologist for this, but I think there were people who probably sincerely felt like the country is not ready to elect a black man to be president in 1988, and we've got to get rid of, I remember quite distinctly this election. We've got to get rid of Reagan, even though it's George Herbert Walker Bush who's running.
Right.
It's still the Reagan era. People perceived it that way, and there was this sort of immediacy. But there's two things that are going on here.
No, go ahead.
Well, in the Washington case, makes it a little bit more explicit. How much of that was, this guy's not part of our network, And so therefore we don't like him, versus this guy's his politics. Because this also, the Harold Washington thing reminds me a little bit of Martha Coakley when she ran for Senate in Massachusetts. Now, she came from the West, and, Massachusetts, there is a very much of an old boy network in Massachusetts politics, and my understanding is that they basically just said, we're not going to give her support in the general election against Scott Brown. Like, we're walking away. And and that I don't think was a question of as much as politics, because I don't think her politics were particularly, ideologically different from these these establishment politicians in Massachusetts. But it's just like, hey, wait a second, we're not going to be the ones to get the largesse. We're not going to get the jobs. We're not going to have the ability to call people and say, hey, I want that low license plate number, whatever it is. Like, that's like, how much of it is just a machine that is distinct from, ideology, and how much of it is ideology when you see this dynamic at play?
So he had all three things going for him or going against him, depending on how you see it. Part of it's race, deeply racist city. All American cities are racist. Chicago's especially so. Particularly in that era. Ideologically, like he had the support of the DSA because they recognized that he kind of aligned with a lot of their politics, and he was talking about. He ran on firing the police chief. He ran against police brutality. And he ran against the kind of economic interests that ran the city, and so there definitely was an ideological gap between him and the machine. And then third, he had the thing that you talked about. He wasn't one of them. Like, he was. In a city that is run on spoils, like, there were going to be no spoils to hand out. And it's one of the most old school machines out there. How you vote determines whether or not you get your trash picked up. And so that was a huge part of it too. But it wasn't just that. Like with Martha Coakley, I think you're right. It's more like it's basically just that. The rest is nihilism. Right. They don't really care. But in this case,
it was a mix.
All of it.